who are in the room know where to find us and how to connect with the sorts of things that we're doing at King's. The Social Science and Public Policy faculty at King's, we have a few, in that faculty, we have a few education agreements. I have signed some of this myself, including postgraduate articulation programs with Yonsei and KDI, both of which are very successful. And we are, in fact, planning to expand our collaboration and our collaborative agreements in this region, in this country. Now, again, the Social Science and Public Policy faculty and the Institute of Psychiatry, Psychology, and Neuroscience, IOPPN, already have well-established research and education links. For those of you from those faculties who want to collaborate on Korea in particular, it's a fine moment to do that because that collaboration continues to grow. We are beginning to intensify research collaboration with the Republic of Korea. Given the high field-weighted citation impact when working together, it's been so encouraging because we do this not just for the research and the impact of that research, but that our students begin to feel direct impact of what we do. We have publications that are multidisciplinary, mostly across health faculties, natural and mathematical and engineering sciences, and IOPPN, in addition to the rich work that our colleagues in the Social Science and Public Policy faculty are doing. And so on this note, I want to welcome the ambassador very warmly. I want to welcome ASWA's colleagues very warmly and all of our eminent guests that are in the room that have had a relationship with King's, with the embassy, who continue to come here to talk to our students, give master classes to our students. It's this kind of rich collaboration that we expect and hope to develop together. But for now, let me warmly welcome all of you to King's. Thank you so much.
So thank you, Funmi. That's really a very gracious introduction. Thank you very, very much. Your Excellency, dignitaries, friends, colleagues. As Funmi said, my name is Adam Habib, and I'm the director of SOAS. And it gives me great pleasure to partner Funmi and the ambassador in opening up this forum. You know, SOAS's historical interest in the Korean Peninsula goes back many, many decades. It's written in the very mandate of the institution itself. And we've been an early supporter, and we've been a recipient of a grant from the Korean Foundation as early as the 1980s. We've just had the opportunity to adopt a new strategic plan at SOAS. And at the heart of that strategic plan, it says Africa, Asia, the Middle East, which is our areas of study, are no longer regions that we study, but they rather the prism through which we understand the planetary questions of our time. These parts of the world occupy the majority of humanity. And if we are serious about addressing the transnational challenges of our time, it seems to me that the perspective of the peoples of Africa, Asia, and the Middle East is absolutely essential to addressing these challenges. And so when we talk about the Korean Peninsula, it's not simply a region of study. It is the prism through which we want to start, or one of the prisms through which we want to understand the planetary questions of our time. Now, we're a university that specializes in the humanities and the social sciences. And of course, for us, this region, the aesthetics within this region, the philosophies that undergird the peoples of this region, its art, its music, are all central to our understandings. But what is also as important is the social sciences and our reflections on the social sciences from this region. You see, in a lot of ways, Korea speaks to the world in many ways. It speaks to the world from the perspective of trying to understand its transition to democracy and its incredible inclusive development agendas that played out over the last 50, 60 years. In many ways, I come from South Africa, and in both the transition to democracy in South Africa and in the reimagination of its economy, South Korea prefigured deeply, in part because of its own experiences and how those experiences speak to the potential for inclusive development in our world. Now, inequality is a huge challenge. It's as much a challenge in Africa as it is in all parts of our world, including the United Kingdom. And if we truly want to understand how to erode these deep, deep inequalities in our society, then the South Korean experience and understandings of what has happened in the Korean Peninsula is particularly important. It's particularly important from understandings of issues of security and development, of denuclearization, regional supply chains. All of these things, all of these issues are fundamental to healing the divides of our contemporary world, to addressing the political challenges of our contemporary world. And the Korean Peninsula is central to this. But Korea and the Korean Peninsula is interesting in other ways. This is a peninsula that had to grapple with how we traverse the world, how you navigate a world of bipolarity in an earlier epoch and a potential world of bipolarity in a future epoch. It was one of the great success stories of how it actually did so and how it navigated itself and enabled inclusive development, enabled inclusion, and enabled addressing the challenges of its own community, whilst at the same time being a responsible member of the human community. All of that holds lessons for many other parts of the world. And it particularly holds lessons for a world community in which increasingly there is the dominant United States and the emergence of China. How we navigate that world in this historical epoch is going to be important. And frankly, the Korean Peninsula brings examples and understandings, both from an earlier epoch and this new epoch. And perhaps I should say one final thing that is important. I think the Korean Peninsula Peace Forum is an important event, and it's important partnership between SOAS and, and King's, and the embassy itself. But what I also think is important is that we are living in a world where all of our challenges are transnational in character. Whether you're looking at this pandemic and why we've got these masks, whether you're looking at climate change, whether you're looking at inequality or social and political polarization, all of our challenges are transnational in character. And if we're going to address these challenges, we need institutional capacity and human capabilities around the world. And if that's going to happen, we need to reimagine higher education. We can't simply imagine higher education where we bring people to London, New York, Berlin, and think that's how we're going to train the peoples of the world. We have to reimagine education so institutions transcend national boundaries. They transcend continental boundaries. And they reimagine a world where we recurriculate, we co-curriculate, we co-teach, we co-credential, where we construct a higher education system that transcends institutional, national, and continental boundaries. That's the future. And so my challenge to King's and to SOAS is, it's fantastic that we built this partnership, but this partnership should go beyond this. It should extend into the Korean Peninsula so that there is that kind of two-way traffic. There is that kind of local knowledge, global science, both ways, that create, if you like, a global humanities, a global social sciences that brings the perspectives of the people of the entire world. And so it seems to me that that is as important. And so I open this for me and the ambassador. I want to say thanks to King's College for hosting this event. Thank you, Ambassador, for supporting this event in the way that you do. And I hope to host this event the next time at SOAS. Thank you very, very much.
Yes, I'm Gun Kim, Ambassador of the Republic of Korea to UK. And at the outset, I'd like to express my deep gratitude to King's College London and SOAS for hosting this event. The reason we annually do this event is because the Korean Peninsula peace is very, very important for us. And in order to achieve it, we need the cooperation and assistance of the international community. So raising awareness at the same time and receiving a lot of input of ideas, resources, even energy from the international community is very, very important. 2 weeks ago, I visited Belfast and I had the chance to look around and personally witnessed the difference. I heard that some years ago there was a very, very strict border control, but now there is none. It's almost no obstacle to visiting Ireland and Northern Ireland, and it's kind of one community already, I guess. So, and when I heard the news, I thought that this is what we achieve on the Korean Peninsula. So, and we need some inspirations from the UK's experience in Northern Ireland also. At the same time, I think this year's forum is very, very interesting to all of you, because many not only UK but many countries in Europe started or announced their new Indo-Pacific policy, or in UK's case, Indo-Pacific tilt, and which means that European countries are coming back to Asia. And when you want to come back to Asia, the first thing you need is to know about the region. And Korean Peninsula is one of the flashpoints in the Indo-Pacific. And it's very, very complex, but also it's kind of interesting because all the big powers are related, US, China, Russia, and Japan. But at the same time, 2 Koreas are involved. So it's very complex, and we need all the help and wisdom of the international community to resolve it. But at the same time, its effects are not only local, but global as well. So I hope that today's forum will give a lot of inspirations and new ideas and new perspectives to see the issue of Korean Peninsula peace. And I hope you, at the end of the day, you will be more interested in Korea, and we get more insights for our problems. Thank you very much.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you very much for joining the Korean Peninsula Peace Forum today. My name is Ramon Pacheco Pardo. I'm a professor of international relations at King's, and I'm going to be chairing this session. Our first session, which is going to focus on the UK's and the EU's approaches towards the Indo-Pacific, and what do they mean for the Korean Peninsula. And I'm going to start by introducing the three distinguished speakers that I have sitting to my left. Then we're going to have a discussion with them, and then we'll open the floor for discussions from the audience. Those who have been able to make it physically here, also welcome to those who are joining us online. So first of all, I have Mr. Reinhold Brandner, who is the head of the Korea division at the European External Action Service, and who is the go-to person really in the European Union to discuss Korean Peninsula affairs. So we are very thankful that you were able to cross the channel, join us via the Eurostar today. Thank you very much, and welcome to London. In the middle of the three speakers, we have Ms. Semi Kim, soon to be Dr. Semi Kim, it can be announced now, who is actually a visiting fellow at the Royal United Services Institute, and who is also based at King's at least until she formally completes her PhD. And last but not least, we have Avinash Paliwal, who is a senior lecturer in international relations at SOAS, and who is a graduate from King's. So welcome back to King's. I think the lesson is obvious. If you come to King's, you will get a job, right? So thank you very much for joining us again. As I said, we're going to begin with a discussion with the speakers, but then I'll open up to the public, and so I see some more people coming in. So we're going to have a round of questions, and then we will have the discussion. And Reinhold, I think I'm going to begin with you, because it is actually 2 months and 1 day since the European Union issued the Indo-Pacific strategy. And in the Indo-Pacific strategy, obviously South Korea, the Korean Peninsula is mentioned, but especially South Korea. So can you start by telling us from a South Korean perspective, sorry, from a European perspective, what is the role of South Korea, the Korean Peninsula, in this EU's new approach towards the Indo-Pacific region?
Yeah, many thanks. Good afternoon. First of all, much appreciated the opportunity to talk here today, and many thanks to the organizers, SOAS, King's College, and of course the mission, the Embassy of the Republic of Korea, Ambassador Kim. What you said is very important indeed. It is indeed, Professor Habib said it, we look at the issue of the Korean Peninsula, and if I say issue, I mean there is a problem in a way, because we don't have peace, and this is why we are here. And I hope the ambassador will agree with me that we hope that there will be a day where this forum will no longer be needed, or it will be focusing on just how do we uphold the peace, not how do we get to peace. Now, let me just say, we look at the Korean Peninsula. Indeed, I find this very important, what Professor Habib had said, that we look at it as an issue which stands for many of the challenges we face in today's world. It's essentially about upholding the rules-based international order. It's about security, peace, prosperity. All this is in this brought together in the challenge that we see in the Korean Peninsula as it looks today. Now, very briefly, go straight to the answering the questions now. The bottom line is really that we in the European Union do believe that what happens in the Asia-Pacific space is of direct relevance for Europe itself, because for the good and for the bad, what happens in the Asia-Pacific region, in the Indo-Pacific region, as we say today, affects Europe itself. And the Korean Peninsula finds itself geographically, politically, and also militarily at the center of the developments in this vast region. Now, it is clear also that this region is currently affected also by an emerging rivalry, competition. Some speak of Cold War between the United States and China. It's yet another region for us to try to get involved there. And against this background, the EU has indeed come out recently with a strategy, as it is called, for cooperation in the Indo-Pacific. It's not just Indo-Pacific strategy, the title matters, because it contains an important message, and I will come to talk about it. It's a strategy for cooperation in the Indo-Pacific, and essentially the purpose is that we as the EU think, because there's so much at stake for Europe itself in what happens in this region, that we cannot just be bystanders. We have to help. We have to help that this region develops in the direction we want to see it go. And this is about peace and security, prosperity, upholding the rules-based international order, as I already said. And therefore, we have a big stake in what is going on in this vast space, and we do believe that we have something to bring to the table. We have a contribution to make in realizing the objectives to which I just referred. Now, let me also be very clear. When we speak about this vast region, of course, all eyes turn immediately also to China, because that's seen as the challenge. You look at the latest reports on the meeting between President Biden and President Xi, the virtual meeting. It's so important, this relationship. But let me therefore just say also, our strategy for cooperation in the Indo-Pacific includes China. It is inclusive insofar possible. So I want to be very clear. It's not a China containment strategy. It's a strategy aiming at working with all partners that are like-minded and are willing to work on the basis that is our basis. And there will be limits probably in the cooperation with China, because our approach towards China is multifaceted. We see China in the one hand indeed as a partner on trade, for example, on climate, for example, or on the Iran nuclear issue. But on the other hand, it's also an economic competitor where we do not have a problem as long as there is a level playing field, let's be very clear. But we also see it as a systemic rival. I'm saying systemic and not systematic rival. It's a systemic rival. It's a different political system. Ultimately, in our view, unfortunately, it's not what we would see as a democracy. So we do have a problem sometimes in dealing with China, and sometimes it's not easy to dissociate these different aspects of China. Now, let me just say that first and foremost, of course, we are interested in working with like-minded partners in this region, and this brings me now to the Republic of Korea also, because together with Japan, but also with Australia, with India naturally, and also the United States, and also the countries of the Southeast Asian Association, we are all like-minded, and we all essentially, broadly speaking, are on the same page. It is for all of us about, indeed, the objectives to which I referred before. And therefore, the strategy for cooperation in the Indo-Pacific is for us, indeed, first and foremost, a strategy for cooperation with these countries, which I've just been mentioning. And this means that looking now at Korea, we are, in a way, in a similar situation. We have strong trade relations with China on the one hand, and many issues where we can partner with China. But on the other hand, we have in the United States our security ally, and we are democracies, and we have certain values which are not necessarily the values of China. So therefore, we do not want to be drawn into a polarization. We want to work with everybody insofar possible. And this situation where we have the similarity, which Europe has also with other countries, Japan is in the same situation, broadly speaking, India is it, Australia, we are in the same situation. We have China is a partner, but on the one hand, on the other hand, the United States is our security ally. And this is for us also then the space in which we engage with the Republic of Korea, because we have a shared interest in making multilateralism effective. Now, let me just say that we have in Korea, in the Republic of Korea, a partner that we call a strategic partner as the EU. Now, this is a label which we have given to the Republic of Korea, and Korea has accepted this label. It is a recognition. It is a recognition of the important role that Korea plays for Europe, but also Europe for Korea. And the notion of strategic implies that we have a relationship which goes, of course, first and foremost about what we want to achieve together to realize our shared objectives. But it is also a relationship which aims at realizing objectives which go beyond the bilateral relationship, be it at regional scale or at global scale. And Korea is a like-minded strategic partner in the region, India is, and Japan is. And these are indeed our primary partners then also in looking how we deal with the Korean Peninsula situation. Now, I wanted to say our strategy for the cooperation in the Indo-Pacific foresees cooperation in 7 areas. Therefore, it is a multi-pronged approach. It is about trade. It is about green transition. It is about ocean governance. It is about digitalization. It is about connectivity, of course, also. And last but not least, about security cooperation, and also human security. And human security today includes also public health issues. Look at COVID, and we all know how important this is. Now, security is one strand, but certainly not the only one, but it is an important strand. And we will indeed wish to engage also with the Republic of Korea, in particular in security cooperation. Now, I do believe that Korea is an important and interesting partner insofar we have a lot achieved already in working with Korea. We do not start from scratch. We have a very strong foundation. We have extremely strong trade relations. We have very good political relations. We work on green transition in a range of sectors. There's a lot we can build on that makes it very positive and very promising also, because we know each other also. And we see this indeed, our cooperation also, as an example for others what is possible in our cooperation, what is possible in the youth engagement in the region. And let me just say that we do also welcome that Korea more recently has been increasingly interested in taking on this role of going beyond issues on the Korean Peninsula itself. We all know that the Korean government, the South Korean authorities, and understandably so, are very much preoccupied with what is going on the Korean Peninsula itself and the conflict with the North and the conflict between the United States and DPRK. But there is a global responsibility which the Republic of Korea is increasingly willing to shoulder. And in implementing our strategy, we look very much to the Republic of Korea also to work with us in helping us implement our shared objectives. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We carry on with Semi, who is now going to look at the role of the UK. You're actually Indo-Pacific visiting fellow here at RUSI, one of the leading think tanks in the UK, of course, and at the global level. And recently we saw the tilt towards the Indo-Pacific from the UK government, from the Johnson government. So can you give us your thoughts on how do you think this tilt can contribute to the situation in the Korean Peninsula?
Thank you, Professor Pacheco-Pardo. Thank you to the Korean Embassy and Kings and SOAS for this forum. It's a pleasure to be here. To the question of how the UK's Indo-Pacific tilt contribute to peace on the Korean Peninsula, I would say there's a lot of areas for contribution, of course, but we will also have to see how this Indo-Pacific tilt develops in the coming few months. To provide some context, this Indo-Pacific tilt was elaborated in a policy paper called Global Britain in a Competitive Age, where it outlined the UK's defense and security guidelines outlines for the next 10 years. And it set a very ambitious goal to be the European partner with the most integrated, with the broadest and the most integrated presence in the region. And actually, there's a lot of overlap with what the EU cooperation guideline for the Indo-Pacific, and that there's emphasis on freedom of navigation, free and open Indo-Pacific, emphasis on the fostering a rules-based order, and partnership with countries in the region. But specifically for the UK's case, this Indo-Pacific tilt is based on 3 pillars of economy, security, and values. And at the moment right now, it's not entirely clear what of these pillars will gain priority or how they will be projected onto the Indo-Pacific region. Some have said that the trade and investment relations is where the biggest opportunity lies, forming these trade investment relations with countries in the region, including China. But others have said that this is actually a chance for the UK to increase its voice on issues of South China Seas or on Taiwan. And so based on this understanding of the different pull and the different interests behind these 3 pillars, we can try to see how the Korean Peninsula fits in. And if we look at the integrated review, which mentions the Indo-Pacific tilt, we see that Korea is mentioned just 3 times. Japan is mentioned 5 times, India is mentioned 17 times, and China is mentioned 27 times. So when we think about the UK's engagement with the Korean Peninsula under this Indo-Pacific tilt, we need to be thinking about it in the context of the UK's broader engagement with the region. And based on this, we can have a realistic look at where is the UK's contribution going to be on the peace on the Korean Peninsula, particularly as we unpack this idea of peace in the Korean Peninsula, usually as it relates to North Korea and the denuclearization issue. And on this matter, the integrated report says that UK will remain the most engaged non-regional partner on denuclearization and on matters of sanctions enforcement. And this strong support for North Korea's denuclearization is very much something that is welcomed by South Korea. It gives further strength to Korea's position as the driver of this peace process. But the UK's strong stance on the sanctions regime may not necessarily always be something that's welcomed by Korea, depending on the domestic politics. And this is because ideas of peace in the Korean Peninsula, there's different priorities depending on the political parties in power. For conservatives in Korea, peace is achieved through a strong military deterrence based on Korea's alliance with the US, whereas the more liberal party, progressives, would say that, well, in order to get to peace, we need to do things like lift sanctions, inter-Korean relations, and this end-of-war declaration that the current Moon administration is strongly advocating for. And so these are important differences within South Korean domestic politics that should be taken into account by policymakers here as they try to strengthen relations with South Korea, especially as we enter the election year in South Korea next March. But going beyond this, there is actually roles that the UK has played on the Korean Peninsula that existed even before this Indo-Pacific tilt. And for example, the UK is very active in documenting and highlighting human rights violations occurring in North Korea. There are also active efforts at engagement through the diplomatic missions, which unfortunately have been closed due to the pandemic. And my final point is that if we take a step back away from the security pillar of the Indo-Pacific tilt and focus on the economic and the values sides, there's actually a lot of areas where South Korea and the UK can mutually benefit from. For South Korea, it fulfills an important goal, which is to diversify relations, which is especially important in the context of the US-China tensions in the region. And areas that the Indo-Pacific tilt highlights, such as climate change, natural disaster relief, maritime security, these are also important aspects of South Korea's own framework for the region called the New Southern Policy. And so the thinking is that by identifying and broadening these areas of overlap, the UK's tilt and South Korea's New Southern Policy can not only find ways to achieve peace in the Korean Peninsula, but also peace in the broader East Asia, Asia-Pacific or Indo-Pacific region. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think now we have covered UK, we have covered Europe, but we have a specialist on Indian foreign policy, Southeast Asian international relations, and of course the Indo-Pacific concept originated from India. It wasn't Trump who woke up one morning and tweeted about it. There was the history of India actually pressing forward with this concept. So Avinash, we're going to move to you. From an Indian perspective and looking at the Indian Indo-Pacific strategy, where do you see the Korean Peninsula fitting within this broader strategy that India has towards the region?
Ramon, thank you so much for having me here. And let me first thank King's College London. It's always good to be back to my alma mater and to see King's collaborate with SOAS. It's really a delight, especially with the Embassy of Korea. Now, you started off the session, Ramon, saying, understanding peace in the Korean Peninsula in the light of the tilt by Americans and the British in favor of the Indo-Pacific, or this narrative of coming back to Asia, as if Asia was a space that anyone could have left. in the first place. And it's very easy, in my view, to forget countries which are not United States and the United Kingdom when one, or for that matter, China, when one is looking at the politics of Korea. So I'm very glad and thankful that there is, more space to get different perspectives. And I think the Indian perspective, not just regarding the advocacy of Indo-Pacific, but also how they actually view a flashpoint of sorts. Because India is in a direct military standoff with the Chinese right now as we speak. And that's a flashpoint which can trigger off any moment, including tomorrow in the next 12 hours if something goes down in the Himalaya. So how is it that a country which is so central, which is listed 17 times in the British concept note to the Indo-Pacific, views Korean Peninsula despite not, despite being one of the more forgettable countries when you're looking at the peninsula, if you think about it like that. The bottom line, and I think this is a very important kind of policy perspective that New Delhi has advocated much more strongly over the last 5 years, is that it is very seriously committed to reunification. Denuclearization, stability, economic relationship is a function of reunification, will be led by that kind of a political settlement of the problem, not the other way around. And I think the causality of how India sees the politics of the peninsula, it's very important. And I'll unpack this bottom line in three broad kind of, aspects which I thought I would kind of lay in front of the audience. The first and foremost is, if you just go back in the 50s, the Korean War, right? The country which actually facilitated the armistice of 1953 was India. This independent, post-colonial, Nehruvian India, which is very seriously committed to what Adam earlier said, larger planetary questions, which is looking at Asia not as a chessboard, but as a space made up of people, as a space which requires certain basic human etiquette, even in interstate relations, as a space where, with whom, a partition with whom India can empathize, or Indians could empathize, having felt the trauma of partition themselves just a few years back in 1947, and having fought a war soon after over the issue of Kashmir with Pakistan. So the thinking in New Delhi right when the war begins is how to actually enable inclusivity, not just on the terms of the big power politics that seems to be becoming the norm even today, the bipolarity which was being referred to, but how to actually look at the experiences of people on the ground, because it is, as the ambassador said, very complex. It's not, the binaries, the moment you reach on the ground, become very complex. So India's historical role is actually quite paramount. It sent the resolution that was eventually accepted by all conflicting sides was an Indian resolution in 1953. India played a very important physical role in getting the armistice signed. And then it was India which actually went ahead and sent forces on the ground as the custodian forces of India, whose single role was to deal with the prisoner of war issue, right? So a very pivotal role in ensuring peace. Now, why is it that India is doing it then? And why is it that that narrative, of reunification continues to hold salience, even if India may or may not have the capacities to deliver today, or might be too distracted with its own geopolitical kind of, focus within its own region? Why has that persisted? And this is something very fundamental. It was not just an idealist streak, as many people would like to believe, of the first Prime Minister of India, Jawaharlal Nehru. In fact, it was very pragmatic as well. It was a very realist calculation that Asia as a continent has so many fault lines, similar to Africa, right? Having experienced decolonization, having experienced the inheritance of state as a unit of operation in the international system without having gone through the process of creating a state the way Europe did. This is fundamentally a fraught process, and the only role one can play in that is that of a peacemaker. And that's the only way forward for any conflict, whether it was over Kashmir or whether it is between North and South Korea. And that line of thinking persists still today. The bottom line, if you want to think of it from a security studies perspective, in Delhi is that if today, in 2021, the flashpoint really kicks off in Korea, all its allies, whether it's the Americans, whether it's the British, whether it's the Australians, the Japanese in particular, will get completely distracted in one part or one corner of Asia, which might be considered to be the heart of a lot of the problems of Indo-Pacific. But there are a wide array of problems that we are actually dealing with when we are looking at the Indo-Pacific. There is a wide difference of opinion of what Indo-Pacific actually means when you're sitting in New Delhi after having left Afghanistan 20 years later, fighting a failed war, which was failed not with the realization of failure didn't dawn in 2020, but was known in 2003, 2004. Mm-hmm. When you're retrenching in certain parts of Asia to say that, look, now we'll all focus on Korea, on Taiwan, on Southeast Asia, that's a problem for New Delhi. Mm-hmm. That's something that all stakeholders will have to contend with, and that partly explains why till 2014, India was the largest exporter of food grain to North Korea. Mm-hmm. This is a very potent, of course, India respected UN sanctions post-2017, but why is it that a country which has so few stakes in North Korea, which has a very enduring, intractable rivalry with China, a systemic rivalry, a boundary rivalry, a military rivalry, would go and export food grains to the North Koreans while having a trade deficit worth more than 10 billion with South Korea? And the why of that question would explain you a lot of issues that may crop up later on as UK and US are thinking about peace in the peninsula. It's simply because they didn't want to leave that space as a binary to either Chinese influence forever, or for that matter, North Korea becoming such a pariah that even basic knowledge creation about a whole people occurs from a certain lens which may not be conducive to peace. Mm-hmm. And I think that's very important. I'll end my kind of response moving forward when we are thinking of India's role in peninsular politics. I think it will be important not to see India as one of those proactive countries which is trying to commit resources in a very material sense to the peninsula. India does not have the resources. Even in 1953, did not have the resources, but it went ahead because of the salience of the issue, how important it was. Today, it doesn't have that kind of resources the way Americans or other European powers and the UK can kind of, decide for their own purposes, whatever that might be, to actually commit to Korea. But I think in a diplomatic and a political sense, India might be one of the most potent regional actors, which can actually complicate the whole strategic calculus around Indo-Pacific within the Quad as a very important player of the Quad moving forward. If tomorrow, let's assume, something goes down in the Himalaya. I'll stop right there, and I welcome the opportunity to be quizzed around the Indian perspective and more. Thank you.
Perfect. No, thank you very much, and thanks for reminding us that there are countries that cannot leave the region, right, or any part of the region, and of course India is one of them. I think we're going to have a couple of more questions about the EU and then the South Korean perspective, and then we'll open up to the audience. Rangel, I think the first one would be for you. If you can zoom in now into peace in the Korean Peninsula and the role that the EU sees itself playing in this ongoing process has been going on for decades now.
Yeah, many thanks, Ramon. Indeed, let's try to zoom in. I was bringing out the EU's interest in influencing developments in the region more broadly. Now, as regards the Korean Peninsula issue itself, it is very clear that the EU has stepped up its ambition to be present and involved to the extent possible in processes leading to settlement of conflicts and preparing peace. This is, I would say, a general message clearly emerging from our Indo-Pacific strategy. Now, the challenge is out. There is no easy way forward. I do think we have to be realistic, and nobody claims that there would be an easy way forward. And let's also be clear, the EU is not in the driver's seat in this context. The European Union is an outside player with a huge, I would say, with a range of options to come in a supportive way, but we are not directly involved in the same way as, of course, the Republic of Korea, DPKR, and the United States are involved, as well as Japan, Russia, and China. We are not neighbors; we are outsiders. But this situation.
If you can talk closer to the microphone, I think.
Even closer, okay. But this situation, it doesn't work, it seems. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. This situation of being not directly involved is in fact our strength, I would think. It gives us an opportunity, a chance to be seen as more neutral than others and able to influence the process, because precisely DPRK also may see us as more neutral than others that bring a lot of baggage historically to this situation, and identifying where we as the EU stand in this process. It also means that we will try to be helpful insofar possible. And as I said, our basic assumption is that we have to work with partners also in this case. So I do believe that if and when the right time is there and the process would be ongoing of negotiations, we would certainly be interested in playing a facilitating role in a multilateral format. I do believe that is something we would be definitely interested in. That is EU position already today. And we believe indeed that we have a lot to bring to the table, because the Europe is itself a peace project. Let's not forget this. It's emerging from a war period. And we have within Europe been able to overcome conflicts. There is experience, a lot of expertise. Europe is certainly in the world today a place where you find most expertise on how to overcome conflict, I would claim. Mm-hmm. And this we would bring to the table. But then also more specifically on denuclearization, the EU has in the Iran process, in the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which now is being revitalized, at least that is our hope, we have gained experience in a leading role. And this we can bring to the table as well. And it is also clear that we bring the technical expertise if needed. And last but not least, when it comes to describing and setting out a vision for the future of DPRK in a broader regional framework, politically but also economically, Europe could certainly be there and provide ideas. Therefore, all this to say that we are definitely interested in stepping our contribution to peace on the Korean Peninsula. We are not in the driver's seat, we do know this, but we are very willing to be not only a bystander and come in when somebody has to pay the bill, but we want to be a player and not just a payer. Thank you.
Thank you. And that line, right? No taxation without representation, right? No. It's always mentioned by European officials. So thanks for reminding us that the EU wants to be proactive in Korean Peninsula peace. One last question, Semi, going to you, because we have talked about the UK approach towards the Indo-Pacific, the EU approach towards the Indo-Pacific, India, of course, as well. We have Germany, Netherlands, France, a number of European countries that also look at the Indo-Pacific. But what is the perspective of South Korea towards these countries looking and engaging, looking at the Indo-Pacific and engaging in this in these strategies? Can you summarize for us, please, how would Seoul see the presence and the interest of these countries in the Korean Peninsula?
Okay, sure. Well, certainly the South Korean government has made a lot of efforts to gain the support of the UK and the EU and other European countries on its policies towards North Korea, both in terms of inter-Korean relations as well as denuclearization and the peace process. And I very much agree with Mr. Brender's mention of the tapping into the experiences of the EU and UK's in conflict resolution, the facilitating and entrepreneurial role that the EU and Europe has played before. Going beyond this, there's also been a lot of positive rhetoric about the prospects of collaboration between these various Indo-Pacific strategies and South Korea's New Southern Policy, which I briefly mentioned. This New Southern Policy is a framework of engaging India and ASEAN, created in 2017. And like the Indo-Pacific tilt, UK's tilt, which is based on 3 pillars, the New Southern Policy is also based on 3 pillars of people, prosperity, and peace. Mm-hmm. And in late 2020, it was represented as a New Southern Policy Plus to take into account the new changing environment, for example, brought on by the pandemic. And this New Southern Policy Plus highlights 7 specific areas that South Korean government will focus on, including health from the pandemic recovery, climate change, development, education, cultural exchange, and so on. And one point that's often very emphasized about the New Southern Policy Plus is that it's not really a strategy per se, but it's more of a framework that's flexible and that can be used alongside other Indo-Pacific strategies. And this was very much the message that was sent between Korea and the EU last month at the political dialogue, where the Korean administration welcomed the EU's cooperation framework towards Indo-Pacific, and the two affirmed that they will seek collaboration between the Indo-Pacific strategy and the New Southern Policy. And this was also the message between Korea and the UK during the G7 in May, as well as the strategic dialogue there, political dialogue there. So in this respect, these various European Indo-Pacific strategies coming to the Korean region is welcome in the sense that they provide areas for South Korea to cooperate with. And this is also a unique opportunity for Korea to boost the peace pillar of the New Southern Policy Plus, which was sometimes criticized for lacking in progress, especially compared to the prosperity pillar. In the context of US-China rivalry, it was rather difficult for Korea to make huge strides in the peace pillar, but with these European and British Indo-Pacific frameworks, there's opportunities for things like perhaps like defense cooperation, joint military exercises, but also cooperation on non-traditional areas as well as human security, for example, pandemic relief and natural disaster relief. Having said this, it should also be mentioned that there hasn't really been efforts to coordinate these various areas of cooperation at a multilateral level. And there's multiple reasons for this. The first is that the European strategies are rather at its nascent stage. The EU's was announced last month, the UK's earlier this year, Germany and Netherlands was late last year, and France was probably the only exception which had an Indo-Pacific strategy from 2018. But there hasn't simply been enough time to coordinate these areas of cooperation or institutionalize them. But another important and perhaps more important concern is that there's reluctance and wariness by Korea to become part of a grouping that could suggest an anti-China grouping. So that explains the lukewarm response to the Quad, for example. So conclude, these European strategies coming to the region is welcomed by South Korea to the extent that they provide greater impetus and valuable know-how concerning the Korean peace process. But going beyond that, there's concern that there may be too much emphasis on a military or strategic aspect of the Indo-Pacific area, which South Korea would be reluctant to be a part of. Thank you.
Okay, thanks to you. It's very good to get obviously the perspective from the region itself and from the Korean Peninsula in this case. We will now open the floor to questions from the audience. So we have a couple of microphones circulating, and we have some 20-25 minutes for the discussion because we started a bit late. So if you can raise your hands if you have a question, we will collect 2 or 3 to begin with, and then when you get the microphone, if you can please identify yourself so the speakers know who they are talking to before you ask your question. So please raise your hands if you have questions. We have someone there in the middle, so we can begin with you.
Hi, thank you for this excellent talk. I'm Tim Hoffer. I'm a master's student at LSE in International Relations. And I mainly wanted to ask Mr. Brender, and maybe to a lesser extent also Dr. Paliwal. So Mr. Brender, you mentioned that the EU does not wish to be drawn into a polarization on the Korean Peninsula. However, as scholars and observers note, China increasingly views the EU not as a third party as in the past, but rather an ally of the US and thus an opponent that needs to be driven out of the region. In fact, Chiang Kai-shek specifically mentioned the need for China to recover Korea, and his nationalist approach seems to have been taken up by the current Chinese administration. How does the EU address this change in perception when it comes to the Korean Peninsula?
Okay, thank you. We can collect 1 or 2 more questions before we go to the answers. Let's see if we get... No one from Kings or SOAS, are you going to let the LSE guy actually dominate the discussion? Come on. Okay, so we have a question on the right-hand side, and you have the microphone next to you.
Okay. Hi, good afternoon, and thank you for Professor's splendid speeches. I'm actually a student from SOAS and the Master of Politics of Asia. And my question is that how do you think of the Koreans' influence, the cultural influence in Europe? As we know that in recently there is a really famous Korean TV series is becoming popular around the world, but also in Europe. So what do you think of such kind of phenomenon that Korean maybe how to say that geopolitics, it may not be as influential beyond the Asia area, but its pop culture or the TV series, the Korean dancing, such kind of things with popular around the world. How do you think of this kind of different phenomena in terms of its politics and culture? Something like that, yeah.
Perfect, thank you very much. So we had two questions. The first one, that China doesn't really see Europe as neutral. It sees it more as an ally of the US. And I think it was directed towards Reinhold and Avinash as well. And the second one is looking a bit into theories, right? The European experience, how it can inform the experience of Asia from a cultural perspective, which I think could be from any of the two scholars that we have on the table. So maybe Reinhold, we can begin with you on the first question, and then we can move to Avinash.
Yeah, many thanks. I think there is, as I said, our relationship with China is multifaceted, and there are areas where we cooperate and others where we compete. And it is also a systemic rival, as I said. And this is a situation where we have to find also common ground with China as with others, that it makes sense for us to be present, as we have a shared interest, and this is why China has also endorsed United Nations resolutions in the Security Council targeting DPRK. It is acknowledged also by China that the DPRK nuclear program is an issue. The question then is, what is the follow-up? How serious is it? Are there other interests at stake? There are no easy answers. The bottom line is that we do want to step up our engagement on security issues in Asia, including on the Korean Peninsula, in working with others. And the prime partner for us, of course, in this situation is certainly also the Republic of Korea. We have acknowledged the leading role that the Republic of Korea will have in finding a solution. So there will be, in a way, for us, an entry point also through the Republic of Korea. And ultimately, we have to find common ground with China, because we all know without China's support and willingness, and that's currently one of the big problems why we do not yet have a solution, because China, for now, is not most actively contributing to a solution.
Perfect. Avinash, go ahead.
Thank you for that question. Again, I mean, look, this whole, a lot around peace or stability in Korea or elsewhere in Asia, I would actually say, I would encourage to look at the Korean question beyond just the Korean question. Just let's look at the various parallel fault lines in the region and how do countries approach them, and where does that fit in the larger framework or in increasing interest in Western capitals with the Indo-Pacific. There is a huge debate on China, right? What kind of a system China is likely to be, and how much can we include, right? We can see that the European Union, led by France, led by Germany, there is a huge push, at least from Germany till the time Frau Merkel was leading the country, right? Now there is a new government will come in, and one of the most potent discussion points in coalition building in Berlin right now is the China question. Mm-hmm. How do you deal with China is actually quite front and center in domestic politics of a lot of big European countries, and is likely to shape European decision-making towards China. How does this whole idea of including a systemic rival really work in the nitty-gritty of it? And how does that work when you have an ally, which is the United States, which has taken a decision that this is just a rival we are dealing with, and offers a lot of evidence of Chinese behavior starting 2013, coming down to 2021, and the kind of centralization of power that has happened within Beijing, as to can you really include a country which is not interested in a certain kind of inclusivity, or has included itself or cooperated, whether it's at the United Nations Security Council in passing resolutions against the North Koreans, or what kind of a voting was that? Was it tactical voting, or was it really an agreement in principle? This is a big debate that is panning out, and the closer you get geographically to China, you can see the intensity of debate actually increasing, and the far you go territorially, you can see that there is much more settlement of where and how these countries view China. I think coming to this whole idea of how this will pan out in a broader Indo-Pacific context, I think it's important to realize that most regional powers are actually very keen on engaging Beijing right now. They don't see the hardline that is coming from Beijing under the current leadership constellation as very conducive to peace, but they're hoping for change at the same time, or they're hoping for some degree of accommodation, however limited that might be. And this is the case even with India. This is the case not just with the Europeans. I think that's something on which there could be silent undercurrents in various regional capitals which are not Washington, D.C. right now. And I think this is something which is this undercurrent of continuing desire and need to engage with China, unlike the Soviet Union, which was a much more binary in some ways, is likely to define the tactics and the timing of how any question of reunification or any question of peace happens. And a very good case was the way North and South Korea were dealing with each other during the Trump administration. You could see that there is a realization within Korea that there are limits to how much you can lead your own peace processes, be dictated or defined or conditioned by big power play. And that's one of the most important aspects. That's how India is thinking, despite being so invested in Quad. The problem with China for India is an Indian problem. They're not fighting the Chinese because the Americans want them to fight. And the Americans really want them to fight. They're fighting with the Chinese because they want to fight for whatever they see is in their national interest. And I think that's something which is very important to realize. So I think it's also I share the view that is coming from Europe, however tenuous it might seem as of now, but we have to give it time to see how it pans out.
And before we move to the second question, you prompted Reinhold actually with a two-finger here. He wanted to follow up with one of the comments that you made.
Very briefly say that the big advantage of our Indo-Pacific strategy is that it puts China into the broader picture of the Indo-Pacific at large. So we very clearly acknowledge that our Asia policy cannot just be China policy. It's China policy and policy towards other countries. And it is precisely the idea of us working together with countries that are in a similar situation, where on the one hand we want to work with China, but on the other hand are systemically different. And we nevertheless have to some degree to find a way to shape together this world, because we are in the same boat ultimately. Yeah? It's a challenge. I'm not saying it's easy, but I do believe the Indo-Pacific strategy brings us into cooperation more than we have been being so far with countries that are like-minded and are in a similar situation, including the Republic of Korea.
Thank you. Semi, do you want to tackle this second question first, please? About culture, exactly, yes.
Yeah. Okay, thank you for the question. We have certainly seen the rise of South Korean cultural products like Squid Games, BTS, and Parasite. And I'm not sure, it's a testament of the power of soft power, the cultural attractiveness, and the exercise of suasion and influence without the use of military or economic power. And I'm not sure how it would apply to the European case, but I'm reminded of something that I read in the news last year, summer, how Korean K-pop fans and TikTok users in a Trump rally in Oklahoma bought just thousands and thousands of tickets that they had no intention of attending. And the Trump's campaign managers were saying that all the tickets were sold out, but when Trump came to the rally, it turned out more than half the seats were empty. And so while this kind of political hijacking can transfer this cultural power or soft power into the realm of politics, is probably something that hasn't been really systematically studied, but which would be very interesting to learn more about.
Mm-hmm. We need a European BTS. That's what you're. And
Yeah,
I see some of my students here. Something to discuss on Thursday. Avinash, you wanted to
Just a
to discuss
very,
this as well.
very quick point on the question of culture. I want to focus on the issue of political culture and what the ambassador has been, talking about this whole like-mindedness and a compact between democracies within the Indo-Pacific. Now, India is actually an outlier in this issue. Let me be very, the like-mindedness for India starts and stops with the China question. Democracy promotion is not New Delhi's business as far as Delhi is concerned. It has a very strong preference for democracies, increasingly less so for liberal democracies, because India's own sort of liberal credentials have taken a bit of a hit with the rise of very strong potent nationalism. Now, that's the ironic bit about Indian political system or political culture, that Hindu nationalism is actually predicated on a democratic project, not on an authoritarian project. Because if you go by the simple math, religious demographic math of India, one person, one vote along religious lines will just fit very well for the Hindu right. So democracy is fine, liberal democracy becomes a problem. And that is where the like-mindedness stops. And that's where, when you look at peace in Korean Peninsula, when you ask a policymaker, perhaps in an informal setting, about democracy in North Korea, or perhaps a more inclusive system in Beijing, which of course no one has the ability to shape directly at least, they will really take a back step and say, look, this is for the people of both countries to decide. We are not going to tell the people of North Korea, the leadership of North Korea, that, hey, go democratic. Because honestly, India is more or less covered by autocracies and authoritarian systems across. And the whole India's liberal project is a very fraught, dynamic project. It has to be fought for. Authoritarianism comes much more naturally to Indian political culture than democracy in some ways, even though the size of the country and the diversity of the country necessitates a more inclusive democratic system at the same time. So these are contradictory impulses, which I think both European Union, the United States and the United Kingdom will have and are having troubles having serious conversations about when it comes to India. And in context of the Korean Peninsula, I think this is something which we'll have to tread very carefully, because we have seen what the idea of democracy promotion or inclusivity really takes us, especially from a Delhi's perspective, looking northwest of India, which is Afghanistan, Iran, the whole Middle East, and the politics of democracy. It's actually not flown very well in a lot of Asian countries. So I think that's something, that's just a word of caution on the issue of culture. It's actually very important, but it's also very important to understand where the cultures of these decolonized post-colonial countries, political cultures, are coming from, because that might be much more potent in influencing the dynamics of peace than less so. Thank you.
Thanks for that, and for reminding us, both of you, really, the role of culture and the different facets of culture as well, right? And soft power, but also and the role of ideas, for example, and perceptions about self, and another, to use an IR term. We have time for one or two more questions. So if you want to raise your hands, we have, now we have 3 questions. So if I can ask you to be brief, so we have time to answer all of them. We can start on the middle there.
Hi, I'm Siray from King's College London. I do public policy in master program. So my question is, what's the best and worst scenario you can picture for the question of the role of China in this problem, in this peace problem? What was the best and worst scenario you can picture? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. We had 2 more people here on the front, and then we have actually 2 more. Sorry, we have 3 more people. Okay, but I think if we are brief, we can collect all the questions. Go ahead, please.
Hello, my name is Alexei, and I'm a King's European Studies student, master degree. And I would like to ask Mr. Brentner, what is your opinion on the role of Russia in this conflict, and does the EU have any plans to hold negotiations with Russia on this particular issue? Thank you.
Thank you. And we have 3 people here in the middle, so I think if you can move the microphone's already there. And if you can pass it along, please, when you ask your question.
Hello, my name is Daniela, and I am from SOAS. I'm a master's student in international studies and diplomacy. And my question is specifically for Dr. Avinash Paliwal. So what model or benchmark of nuclear disarmament would you suggest countries that have it and countries that want others to not have it, should we impose that would sort of even the level playing field and, have both sides meet in the middle? Because Mr. Reynold Brenner said that we have to uphold peace and not just to obtain peace in that sense. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Suyan. I'm from King's College London. I study international development. And my question is I believe that right now at this moment, as we're talking about this Korean Peninsula and peace, people in North Korea, they are suffering right now, and I think the humanitarian crisis is very serious. So at this point, what can we do about this humanitarian crisis, and what kind of help can we put in North Korea? Because I think global political tension right now, and even US or EU trying to help North Korea or like to open up, that would make them be more tensed, and they will build more armaments than helping their own people. So I wonder what can we do about it? Humanitarian crisis. Tk you.
Perfect. Last but not least, Giovanni. Go ahead.
Hello, my name is Giovanni. I'm also a King's student. I'm doing the double degree in policy and governance in Europe. My question is for everyone, and it's rather simple but also complex at the same time. I'm just interested in what is the North Korean perspective on peace in the Korean Peninsula. We mentioned, I don't know if there is a peace perspective for the North Koreans, but we've mentioned, the different perspectives between conservative and liberals in South Korea. We mentioned the Indian perspective. I was interested in seeing what the North Koreans thought about the future of the peninsula, also in relations to nuclear weapons, because I've always thought, and I don't know if I'm wrong on this, but the fact that they use nuclear weapons is sort of as a deterrence or a way of enforcing their state sovereignty, as a sort of guarantee that they can use nuclear weapons or have it as a guarantee to say, if anything happens to us, we have it as a backup plan so that we can enforce our state sovereignty. So I was interested in seeing how, what they see the future as being, and how we can sort of ensure that their state sovereignty is protected in a way as a way of reducing their use of nuclear weapons. Sorry.
Thank you. So we have 5 questions and 5 minutes, so you can do the maths, right? Even social scientists can do the maths on this, right? So I'm going to go one by one with the questions that we have. Some of them they already asked you directly, but some others we can ask anyone on the table. I think, Semi, maybe you can take on the first one. The best and worst case scenario of China's involvement in the Korean Peninsula. What would be these scenarios?
Be very brief. The best scenario, I guess, with China's full cooperation on the sanctions regime, with China's push to North Korea to help come to the denuclearization table, and the start of the denuclearization talks would be the best case scenario. The worst case, I was thinking more broadly towards the Indo-Pacific region, but perhaps a contingency on the Taiwan situation. And I'm also reminded back to the 2017, where we had the bloody nose strike, surgical. That was a real period, that was a brief period where war looked like it could be a possibility. So that would be possibly the worst situation. Should I just go ahead with the other?
Yeah, you can go ahead a bit longer. Yes, absolutely.
So the humanitarian question, I really look forward to the second panel where we will have the speakers discuss this as well. But from the UK side, UK's policy on North Korea was one of carrots and sticks called critical engagement. But for many years, there's been a lot more sticks than carrots. And the thinking was that we will induce North Korea to have to come to the denuclearization table to change how they calculate the costs and benefits of pursuing nuclear weapons. But we know that that has not only been ineffective, but that has actually clamped down on the engagement part of critical engagement. And so from the UK side, maybe more proactive efforts to engage North Korea would lead to some improvements in the humanitarian situation. For the South Korea side, it's actually regrettable that in the past couple of years, South Korea was not a co-sponsor to the UN resolutions condemning North Korean human rights. there's a lot of controversy regarding the banning of propaganda leaflet activists on the Korean border. Of course, there's concerns of the South Korean residents living near the border as well, but those are some of the criticisms that the current administration received for its lack of attention to the humanitarian issue. And I think it'll be very important in the next administration for sure for South Korea to take a very principled and considered, consistent position when it comes to North Korean human rights. Yeah, I think I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you. Avinash, there was a question about benchmark for disarmament, which was directed to you.
Yes.
If you want to tackle it, please.
Thank you for that question. It's an excellent question. Now, India's preferred model for any country that has nukes but is non-signatory to the NPT is, well, the India model. Don't sign the treaties if you don't want to, because Indian perspective about these treaties has been that these are exclusionary treaties, not inclusionary. And for certain reason, and this whole idea of nuclear apartheid, which was very prominent in 1970s, 80s, 90s India, is something that I think in different ways informs North Koreans or other countries who seek a weapon, have shared, and kind of, justify themselves for building a weapon, also based on their threat perceptions. But the fact of the matter is, New Delhi would say that, look, if you have the weapon, fine, don't sign the treaties, but follow them to the letter unilaterally. Put a self-imposed moratorium on testing, stop undertaking provocative, long-distance, cross-continental missile tests. Don't start signaling coercion now that you actually have the power. And I think that's the key point here. Now, of course, a lot of that is easy for India to say because it's not considered to be, it's one of the few countries, apart from perhaps Israel, which is not considered to be a nuclear pariah. In fact, is very much part of a system in parallel rather than in the mainstream. With North Korea, especially in particular to the North Korean case, I think the Indian problem has been the proliferation angle. India is has been directly impacted by proliferation of a transnational nuclear network, the source of which was in Pakistan, the AQ Khan network, which had active links with not just kind of dictatorships in Middle East and North Africa, but also with North Korea itself. In 2009, India seized a North Korean ship off the coast in Malabar, where they started inspecting it for nuclear material. So I think the discomfort and perhaps also the very deep depth engagement of India with Pyongyang after that 2009 incident was to make sure that it has independent channels with Pyongyang, and that doesn't happen through third parties. That has gone down considerably over the past 5 years, but that's what Indian thinking is, that, if you have the nukes, no one can easily take it away from you. Discipline yourself.
Thank you. And Reinhold, we had a question on Russia and its role in the Korean Peninsula from a EU perspective.
Yeah, many thanks. Russia is certainly a country with which we have, I would say, quite a number of issues open. If you look at the Ukraine situation, if you look at energy flows and other issues, our cooperation with Russia is not easy, but it is an important country in the wider European neighborhood. Therefore, it's a country with which we do engage, of course, which is a member of the United Nations Security Council and which has also indeed endorsed the relevant Security Council resolutions. So ultimately, like China, I do know, of course, that there are questions as to full, I would say, support or not that the country would provide to the sanctions implementation. Ultimately, we have to find a framework where the Russian and Chinese interests are sufficiently met, which are acceptable also to us. In a process which will involve indeed ultimately not just the Republic of Korea and DPRK and the United States, but indeed also Russia and China and probably also Japan. And this is what I referred to before when we were when I referred to a multilateral framework, which we ultimately probably need, which we will need at one point to anchor whatever the main protagonists in this conflict will have to work out. Yeah. And on humanitarian, if I may just come in, that's a very important topic, of course, also for us, humanitarian aid. Of course, we do know that the situation in DPRK is dire.
First point. Second point, for us, humanitarian aid is disconnected, is distinct from political questions. It's not something which is for us an element in bargaining. It is distinct from this, and we provide humanitarian assistance if there is need. In this case, there is need. We would provide assistance today if we would get into the country. The problem is DPRK has completely closed its borders to the COVID situation. And essentially all 8 donors have left the country. The EU assistance, which we had been ongoing, we have had, for many years, we have had food security programs ongoing to the tune of a couple of million euro per year, therefore not negligible. But this has come to a halt because we have not been given the possibility any longer to send our experts in to monitor also the implementation of the program. So therefore, it's up to DPRK. If and when we can get in, I'm pretty confident we would provide humanitarian assistance again, and also food security, which technically is slightly different for us. But that is the answer to your question.
Thanks a lot. I mean, we did have a question that I'm going to leave with the second panel, because in the second panel we have 2 diplomats who lived in the DPRK, a journalist who deals with DPRK issues. The question was about North Korea's perspective on peace. So those of you who have been on the ground, if you can actually tackle this question as part of your session. Now I would like to thank the panelists. If you can join me in thanking them for an excellent discussion. And I think we can reconvene in 10 minutes, so we can have a 10-minute break, then the second session, and then we will have the reception afterwards. So the coffee is right outside, as far as I know.
Okay, hello. Shall we get started, please? Thank you. Right. Okay. I am Ta Chan Kong, the moderator of the second panel, Europe and the experience of engagement with the DPRK. I'm a reader in comparative politics at SOAS. I'd like to thank King's College for hosting this event and also for the support from the Embassy of the Republic of Korea. We have three very knowledgeable panel members. Let me introduce them. Sitting on my left, directly on my left, is Ms. Ju Hyung Hong, a reporter for the Sege Ilbo, the Korean newspaper, the Sege Times. She started her job as a journalist in 2013 and covered domestic politics in South Korea for 5 years. Since 2018, she's been looking at international affairs around the Korean Peninsula, inter-Korean relations, defense issues. She covered the Hanoi, North Korea-US summit and the two inter-Korean summits. Currently, she's on leave for 1 year for study at the LSE. And next to her is Dr. James Ho. James has worked in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office for 33 years as a research analyst. He has a PhD from the University of London. James has served in the British Embassy in Seoul and in Beijing, and he was the first head of mission in Pyongyang when Britain decided to establish diplomatic relations with North Korea in 2001. He served in the role of chargé d'affaires. Since retiring from the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, he's been teaching at SOAS sometimes. He's also an active scholar, historian, and frequent commentator on television and radio. He is also the winner of the Wudang Prize. Okay, I got that one right. On my far left is Ambassador John Everard. John spent 27 years in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, during which time he served in British embassies in Austria, Bosnia, Chile, China. He was the ambassador to Belarus, to Uruguay, and finally to the DPRK from 2006 to 2008. And I think John was actually Britain's youngest ever ambassador. And since he retired from the Foreign Office, he's been a researcher, a research fellow, a Pantech research fellow at the Shorenstein Asia-Pacific Research Center at Stanford University. And after that, he was the coordinator of the United Nations Security Council panel of experts dealing with sanctions against the DPRK. And he has also written extensively for the media, broadcasts, lectured on Korea and international affairs. So this is our panel, a very, very knowledgeable and distinguished panel. I will kick off with the first question, building on what we were talking about in the first session about the role of Europe in the DPRK nuclear issue. The European powers, in the P5+1, I think 3 European powers, Britain, France, and Germany, also the European Union, were involved in the making of the Iran nuclear deal in 2015. So Europe has experience in the participation and resolution of these types of issues. So what role can Europe play in the resolution of the North Korean nuclear issue? And how important are diplomatic relations with Europe to the North Koreans? And here I will start with Ju Hyung.
Okay. Yeah, this is working. So thanks for having me today. And even though Professor Tachan said I'm knowledgeable, but I just covered this issue for 3 years. But I think I have observed this issue most recently. So yeah, I just try to convey my thoughts directly, and also yeah, I called a lot of my interviewees in Seoul, and I will try to convey their ideas, yeah, frankly. So yeah, first, well, most of my interviewees in Seoul agreed. From the South Korean part, the biggest role that European countries can contribute to the North Korean issue is the messenger role or mediator role. So currently, North Korea and the US do not want to invite other countries to their negotiations. So basically, the framework is bilateral. Of course, 6-party talks countries have been and are playing their roles in their parts. But I don't think for a while, multilateral framework would be brought back to the Korean Peninsula. So in that sense, other countries cannot be a game changer, including European countries, but still they are an important actor in supporting or facilitating this talk by mediating two countries. Well, South Korea, as the sincerest stakeholder, is struggling to revive the talks between the North and the US. But North Korea is a handful counterpart, as you know. So they sometimes disappear from the talk, and the talks often get stagnant, halted for a while. Sometimes the silence gets longer, which we have experienced since 2019 Hanoi summit. Well, European countries can contribute to building the resilience of negotiation. In other words, they can use their networks in North Korea to convey South Korea or US ideas to the North, specifically during the stalemate, like these days. I believe this is what South Korean policymakers or negotiators mostly and sincerely want. It has been said that European players have made a significant role in Pyeongchang Olympics behind the stage when South Korea mediated the North and the US in early 2018. Even though journalists have not focused on that issue much. A lot of European countries have diplomatic relations with the North, including the UK, and given its contribution to humanitarian support to North Korea, these countries surely will have some non-governmental networks as well, so we can use these networks to facilitate the talks between North Korea and other countries. So specifically, during my coverage for the past 3 years, the biggest presence of European countries that I could observe was the Swedish mediator's role between the North and the US, which was explicit from early 2018 to late 2019. So Sweden was quite successful in playing a role as a so-called honest broker, in that North Korea seemed to trust Sweden as a mediator. I would say that is the key. So the condition of being a mediator is that two countries equally trust the country as a mediator. So there are 3 scenes of Swedish presence in North Korean nuclear negotiation for the past 3 years that I remember from my coverage, but can I elaborate this one? Yeah. So yeah, from December 2017 to early 2018, aside from South Korean mediation between the North and the US in Pyeongchang Olympics, there was another channel that Sweden played a role. So Swedish Special Envoy to North Korea, Kent Hagstedt, Ambassador Kent Hagstedt, was invited to Pyongyang in December 2017. And one of my interviewers actually said negotiations between North and the US on the detainee issue, detained people, mediated by Sweden, was the starting point of trust building between the North and the US. So that was led to the US-North Summit in Singapore in June. And the second scene I remember is that in January 2019, before the Hanoi Summit, right before the Hanoi Summit, South Korean top nuclear envoy, Lee Do-hun, and U.S. Special Representative for North Korea, Stephen Biegun, and North Korean Vice Foreign Minister Choi Son-hee met at the suburbs of Stockholm for the pre-negotiation of the Hanoi summit. They were there to join the SIPRI conference, Swedish think tank conference. So it was a 1.5 track channel. So Sweden provide that stage for talking among stakeholders. So in October 2019, that was the last thing I remember. So after the failure of the Hanoi summit and a stalemate following that, Stephen Biegun, the representative from the U.S. side, and North Korean counterpart Kim Myung-gil once again met in Stockholm to revive the stalled negotiation. So Sweden actually suggested another talk after 2 weeks, but this has not been realized, unfortunately. So we can see that Sweden was quite successful in mediating the North and the U.S. for when we observed the past 3 years, and sometimes it supported South Korea as well as a messenger to North Korea. So North Korea seems to trust Sweden as an honest broker, in that Sweden does not pressure North Korea with the perspective of other Western countries and tries to be neutral between the North and the US seemingly. So actually, I want to add the last point. So we have to think about here, can other European countries be an honest broker, including the UK and other key European players? So I asked my interviewees in Seoul whether or not they agree with this. And actually, interestingly, their answers were divided. So there were people who said no, and they said the UK and France could not be an honest broker because they are closer to the US. In other words, North Korea does not trust them as a neutral mediator. The UK and EU have the most robust commitment to the UN non-proliferation framework. And they are the strictest human rights protector. And the UK government published the UK sanction list independently, as long as I know. So they argued that because of this, North Korea does not trust the UK as a honest broker. But there were also people who said yes. They said that the Swedish role as a mediator is not a unique role for Sweden. So though Sweden could be more active for the past 3 years because of some factors, such as its seemingly neutral stance between the North and the US, and Ambassador Kant's extraordinary devotion to the Korean Peninsula problem, other European countries, such as the UK, can be a mediator with its strong network in Pyongyang. So a lot of North Korean high-ranking diplomats started their careers in European countries and the UK. Actually, I remember that Ambassador Lee Soo-yong is also also started his career in the UK. So one of the North Korean problem experts said that when North Korea closed the door and the official channel was frozen, the European players' messenger role was significant to reaching North Korean from South Korean part. Well, people who have this view said European countries could continue their critical engagement in North Korea. So what I mean is, even though North Korea does not like European countries' strict stance on its human rights problem and sanctions, North Korean officials understand that this is those countries' principles in diplomacy, and they separate those issues when they find someone to mediate between them and their US counterparts. So yeah, there's one more point. This is my guess, based on observation, that some South Korean officials, negotiators, would welcome European countries' critical engagement because European countries can be vocal in international community about North Korean activities and human rights problems instead of them. Actually, South Korea is in a tricky stance because it wants to revive the talks between the UK, the US and North Korea, so they cannot be aggressive in North Korean human rights problem in the international community, and European critical engagement will replace that role in the international community. Yeah, so that's my observation.
Thank you very much. James?
Come on, it's Jim.
Jim.
Nobody ever calls me James.
Jim, after 20 years, Jim.
Even the North Koreans call me Jim. Just to put the record straight about Sweden. Sweden is not an independent mediator. Sweden has represented United States interests in North Korea. It has a diplomatic role since at least the 1970s, because there are no diplomatic relations and no formal diplomatic contacts between the United States and North Korea. So Sweden has played a very important role, particularly during the famine years when it got clearance for United States airplanes. All the United States visits, the actual mechanics of getting the people into the country and so on, are handled through Sweden. So that's the Swedish role. I think the North Koreans have got very used to Sweden. It's been one of the Western countries longest with a diplomatic mission in North Korea. And indeed, for a time, that diplomatic mission was funded by the United States. But Sweden eventually decided that it no longer wanted that arrangement because it would have its own interests. Now, generally, the role, my particular knowledge is dated now. I was there 2001, 2002. I had to retire shortly after that. But at that time, there was a great deal of hope that the meeting between Kim Dae-jung and Kim Jong-il had sparked interest in the international, I don't use the term international community, but in the world generally. There was great belief that North Korea, under Kim Jong-il, was changing and was moving away from isolation. Now, they had been arguing for years and years that they wanted diplomatic relations with European countries. The only one, I think, apart from the Scandinavian countries, who had their own particular reasons, was Malta, had early contact, and then Italy early in 2000. Us in December 2000, Germany. Now, Germany was in a particular interesting position because Germany had staff in North Korea, but it did not recognize it did not have diplomatic relations with North Korea until March 2001. There was a German interest section, part of the Swedish embassy. That was a time, as I say, of hope. The North Koreans finally persuaded, they thought, the European countries to establish diplomatic relations with them. In reality, the reason why the European countries established diplomatic relations with North Korea at that time, including Britain, was that the South Korean government under Kim Dae-jung said, please bring this country out of the cold, have relations with it, make contact with it. And eventually all the European countries except France, that may have been sour grapes because Britain got there first, all the European countries did establish diplomatic relations, but very few of us actually opened embassies there. And Britain was, Germany was, Sweden was already there, and that was it at that time. Some came later, but that was all the European countries who actually opened embassies. The Italians had an aid office, and eventually the French had an aid office as well. The Italians had left by that time. Switzerland had diplomatic relations, but no embassy in North Korea at that time. The North Koreans, I think, were disappointed at that. They had seen Europe, and including Britain, as playing a different role from the United States. But what they found was that the policies of the European Union were almost identical to those of the United States. denuclearization, human rights, and so on. The other factor around that time, of course, was the vast amount of humanitarian aid that went in with the EU and individual contributions often through the UN agencies as well. And that sweetened the relationship with Europe. But there was no fundamental change that North Koreans found in the way the Western world looked at them. It was still, it seemed to them, and it still seems to them, largely through the eyes of the United States. And that is a problem. It wasn't just Europe they had negotiations with. They had negotiations with Japan. I remember when I was in Tokyo, the Japanese counselor coming out of one meeting and saying, nobody had ever talked to him like that in the world before. North Koreans are very tough negotiators. Although the European Union tried to keep up a good relationship, there were all, and a united relationship, there were always tensions within that relationship. Some countries, the Netherlands and Belgium in particular, were very hot on human rights and wanted that as to be the dominant issue with North Korea. Other countries, including Britain, saw the nuclear issue, at that point at least, as being the more important issue and the issue of most threat to the outside world. Human rights were not ignored, but they were not emphasized quite as strongly as they would become later. Any residue of those high hopes of 2001, 2002 have long since dissipated. Europe is now seen, I'm afraid, as sort of sometimes a bit friendly, a bit more friendly than the United States. Indeed, there were many North Korean diplomatic missions in Europe, and many senior diplomats cut their teeth in Europe. But it is not seen as a likely broker in any agreement that matters to the North Korea, in particular the question of relations with the United States. It's the same in a sense with China. It's not China the Chinese would argue that has caused the problem. It's the United States that's caused the problem by being in Korea, intervening in Korea, and so on. And it's only the United States that can solve the problem. So I'm afraid I don't really see a major role for the European Union, and certainly not, despite the brave words that occasionally come out of odd bits of the British foreign policy establishment. I don't see Britain playing a major role either. Sorry to end on a gloomy note.
And John?
Not gloomy enough. I agree with most of what Jim has said. In fact, when we talk about North Korean disappointment with Europe, you can put a date on it. It was 2005 that the North Koreans switched the vice minister who used to deal with European affairs from a really quite senior and hard-hitting member of the party who was able to get the Europeans all kinds of things that they wanted, to a pleasant but rather bumbling, fairly junior member of the system, indicating that they had effectively, at that point, given up on Europe. Reinhold this morning was talking about Europe being a player, not just a payer, but it is frankly very difficult to see what kind of role Europe can play, apart from contributing financially to whatever final solution is determined for the Korean Peninsula. With all respect to fellow panelists, I just don't see the European Union or individual European countries as taking on a mediating role. There may have been an opening for such contribution in the past, but I think two things have put an end to that. The first was the Trump-Kim summits. I think in a world in which the North Koreans have seen that they can actually have access to the United States at the highest level, if they play their cards right and directly, their interest in mediation is significantly reduced. The other, I think, is the horrible mess in which the North Koreans now find themselves, which I think is bringing about a sense of desperation. They'll look for quick solutions, not the kind of slow, gradual build-up of diplomacy that you would associate with bringing in third countries as mediators. We talked a lot about Sweden, just a footnote here. When dealing with the North Koreans, it's probably worth remembering that the reason that Sweden set up an embassy in Pyongyang way back in the 70s, long before any of the other Europeans, was that in the 70s, in a moment of great generosity, Sweden gave North Korea a whole lot of loans and money to buy 1,000 Volvo cars. The North Koreans said, thank you very much. And the cars are still running around Pyongyang, still held together with various bits of literally chewing gum and string. Here we are, decades later, and the Swedes set up an embassy trying to get their money back. They still haven't got their money back, and the embassy is still sort of there. Finally, on point of mediation, European presence in Pyongyang, please remember there is none right now. Various European countries do formally have embassies in Pyongyang, but they've all been not closed, comrade, but de-staffed because of the COVID crisis. The North Koreans were not allowing any foreigners to enter North Korea, so if you went on leave, you couldn't get back in, and you couldn't rotate staff. And one by one, the European embassies simply gave up and pulled their people out. The very last two, the last two Romanians, actually left Pyongyang about a month ago. All the European embassy buildings are now sitting empty. Sad.
Thank you very much for that. Well, given the importance of the United States as the party that North Korea wishes to deal with directly, this actually leads to my second question about the prospect for the development of inter-Korean relations, also North Korean-US relations in the next 6 months, in the remaining life of this current government. In recent statements by both Kim Jong-un, in which he said that North Korea, United States, and South Korea, they are not the arch enemy. Also for United States, Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, says that the U.S. has no hostile intent towards North Korea, and Song Kim, the United States Special Envoy for North Korea, said that the end-of-war declaration proposed by President Moon is worth exploring. Given these, positive statements that we have, positive gestures, what do you think there are any prospects for the improvement of U.S. DPRK relations in the foreseeable future? I will start with John.
There are always prospects. Hope springs eternal, but it's important to remember that we've been in better situations than this at several points in the past. Great hopes have been raised and then dashed as agreement after agreement has been made and then just ignored or fallen apart. I'm not going to here go through the long, sad litany of crashed agreements between the US and the DPRK, but it does make quite sobering reading. The end-of-war declaration may have some mileage in it, and it would certainly be a step forward in terms of mutual understanding between the DPRK and the US if they could reach such an agreement, and if that led them to establishing some kind of permanent liaison mechanism, embassies or interest sections in each other's capitals. That would be a significant easing of tensions. There is a tendency here a trap into which I think I just fallen myself, to suggest that an end-of-war declaration would require simply the agreement between the North Koreans and the United States. Formally, of course, the foreign intervention in the Korean War was under the auspices of the United Nations Security Council, so that you would actually need a security resolution to unpick all this, which would mean that we, the UK, the French, the Russians, everybody would have a say in it. It'd be quite a diplomatic marathon. The big problem, I think, is that although the North Koreans have been signalling that they would be willing in principle to look at an end-of-war declaration, they haven't yet signaled what kind of price they would demand for that. One of the curiosities of the situation is that although for some years the North Koreans were suggesting that they wanted an end-of-war declaration, as soon as another party suggests it, they quickly claimed that actually, they weren't that keen on it, but they could talk about it. So, they make it something that they would be prepared to concede rather than something they want. Previous experience with the North Koreans in negotiations suggests that the price they will demand for such a declaration will be very high and may simply be unpalatable. I mean, as this morning's session was saying, some of the prices, some of the things they've demanded in return for denuclearization have been really eye-wateringly high and have caused various negotiations to stall. I fear that as we explore this possibility further, we will find a repeat of this pattern, that the North Koreans, desperate as ever for help of political, economic of any kind, will set the price too high and the negotiations will falter.
Thank you, John. Jim?
One complication in all this, which nobody's mentioned, is of course that Mr. Moon's term of office ends next year. And the North Koreans, on past record, are not going to give him any concessions that, if they think that he's not going to be, or his successor is going to be somebody from the other side, the more conservative side. So whatever noises are made about you're not our permanent enemy, I don't think that next year is going to see any great breakthrough there. What was the other point I was going to make? There's also, I think, quite apart from the long tensions, there's also real concern in North Korea that any agreement with any particular US president can of course be overturned by the next one. Mr. Clinton's statements went out of the window as soon as George Bush was in power. So again, there's a concern there. Yes, of course, South Korea is not its permanent enemy. Of course, the United States is not its permanent enemy. That's Japan. If they're really pushed into a corner, they'll say, "Yeah, we've been enemies of the North." Well, they'll never say they've been enemies of the South Koreans, but they say we've been enemies of the United States for 100 years since the little war that the Americans fought in 1871. Not very successful. But with Japan, we've been enemies for 1,000 years. So, there's a bit more to overcome there. But I really think it's unlikely we're going to see in the next 6 months or even somewhat longer any real change on the peninsula. Again, I don't like always ending up with a negative note, but you do sometimes find that that's where you're led, and that's where I think I am led, that I see little chance of a real breakthrough coming on the peninsula.
Okay. As well, I strongly agree with them. Moreover, well, South Korea has a presidential election next March, which makes the US and North Korea hard to take aggressive action at this moment. Well, actually, Korean Vice Minister Choi Jong-gun visited the US recently to discuss this issue, but I would say the US interest would not be as strong as the Korean government. But I do not say that only a pessimistic future exists in the next 6 months, because now the South Korean government seems to make an effort to reach out to North Korea with the idea of sharing vaccines. Now the whole world is getting into the stage of living with COVID after the vaccination, but North Korea is only the exception. So they cannot stay longer with this measure, I believe. South Korea and the US will find a moment to engage North Korea when they are ready to be supported. I think this kind of cooperation is the only way that is possible for the next 6 months.
Thank you very much.
Yes. Just briefly. I've remembered what I was going to say. An end of war declaration is probably quite unnecessary. The war has ended. The war ended with the armistice, because the armistice is held. Now, it's not held perfectly. There have been ups and downs, but each time there's been a crisis, one side or the other has backed away from it. And none of those crises, some of them very serious, but in the 1960s, it was much more serious than it was ever later. There were artillery duels all along the demilitarized zone, both sides firing heavy artillery at each other. When I was in South Korea in the 1980s, there were several incidents of North Korean submarines landing on the South Korean coast. Just in 1968, some of you will know that there was an attempted attack on the Blue House by North Korean Marines. But the armistice held all the way through there. So I think the end of war declaration, it's fine sounding, but as our Foreign Office legal advisors once said, in this very context, when our Ministry of Defense was saying we'd have to go to war if there was war on the Korean Peninsula, well, they said no, because the war has ended. And you would need new UN resolutions to go to war, as was done in 1950. And that would all take an awful lot of effort. And the United Nations has changed an awful lot since 1950. So I think I wouldn't get too hung up on end-of-war declarations.
Okay, thanks for that. Thanks for that, Jim. Before I open it up to the floor, I think there was a question from the last panel. What was that question, Ramon? How would North Korea see the discussion about peace declaration situation in the Korean Peninsula? So in effect, we've dealt with this question.
We've dealt with that.
We've dealt with this. We've dealt with this question. So maybe I'll open this up to the audience. Questions from the audience. So I see a question. I see a questioner there. So I'll take a couple of questions.
Thank you so much for a very insightful talk. I'm Hiromi from SOAS. I'm a politics and IR student. I found it interesting how you mentioned about EU not being the broker of, like in terms of like negotiations and mediating issues for North Korean people. But like speaking from like Japanese perspectives, although we owe a lot of historical responsibilities for what is currently happening in the peninsula, we have issues with North Korea, especially, I mean the DPKR missiles that have been like sent to Japan on a monthly basis, actually, and we actually have to like install this emergency alert system in which we like teach children to hid under tables when we hear the alert in case of North Korean missiles like arriving at our nation and stuff. And also with the problems of abduction and abduction issues on North Korea and Japan. I was just wondering, like, if EU can't be the broker or the mediator, and Japan will certainly not be the mediator at all, I probably assume, just as you have mentioned already, like that we can only establish a diplomatic cable through the US or China with like the six-party talks. But do you have any like provisions for like any other potential mediator or broker that could, like, I don't know, that could somehow penetrate this whole hostilities in the region? My apologies if it sounded really broad and unclear.
Okay, we've got that question about other potential sources of mediation. Another question, yes?
Yeah, hi, can everybody hear? Okay, nice. Hi, my name is Marius. I'm a master's student at King's International Political Economy, and my question was, first of all, thank you for the great panel so far, and maybe for the, like, you said gloomy, but maybe others say realistic picture. My question would be, since it's like the standoff is quite tense right now, and also both sides don't seem to like move really far, how do you think, or how long could North Korea or the DPRK could sustain their isolation? Will there be ever a point? I mean, they've been doing it for like almost 70 years now. There's been a lot of talk about smuggling routes and what's or not. Do you think they can sustain it in the future, or at one point they have to make the move and like lower their what they want for in turn for negotiations, or like more opening up? My question is, what do you think from like a historic perspective and not looking at the future, how long they can sustain it? Thank you very much.
Very interesting question. I'll take one more. There's one here.
Hi, thank you. My name is Momo. I'm from the LSE. I'm doing my master's in media and communications. So my question is actually about the election next March in South Korea. So as you know, like under the current president, so actually I think he's like, from the media coverage, he's quite pro unification of North and South Korea. So I wonder, what is DPRK's stand on unification, and how does EU see the unification of North and South Korea, and what kind of changes you can see? So if the, like after next March's election.
So how do the panelists see the unification of North Korea?
Of North and South Korea, and also what kind of changes they are. Okay. All right. So my question is, what is DPRK's stand on the unification with South Korea? And how does EU see this unification of North and South Korea? And what do you think, will there be any changes after the next March's election? So is that clear?
Thank you very much. All right, okay, so we have three interesting questions from students from SOAS, King's and the LSE. So let's take the first one then. If the EU, we're gloomy about the role of the EU as a broker, mediator for peace. Are there any other potential sources of mediation? The United Nations, for example. Any other or other countries in the south, for example, that North Korea might be more comfortable with. All right, John.
We can approach this question in the context of what role there might be, if any, for the European Union. I think you need to sort of draw the camera back a little more broadly. I think that the time for the kind of mediation you're talking about is past. I don't think the North Koreans want or need mediation. They can talk directly to all the people with whom they have problems. The United States has made clear that it's prepared to talk anywhere, anytime, no conditions. The Republic of Korea has been trying, it seems almost daily, to reach out and establish communications lines with the North. And the new Japanese government appears willing to talk. What's the point of having a mediator? You can talk directly to these people.
Okay. So Jim, that's your answer? You agree with that entirely?
Yeah, I would agree with that entirely. I don't really see the need for anybody else to be involved. Other countries or organizations like the EU may feel they want to play a role, but it's not necessary. It's not necessary at all. And I don't think multilateral systems are not terribly popular with North Korea ever since the United Nations intervened in 1950. So I agree entirely with John on this, that you're very lucky. I think this is the first time we've agreed on virtually everything we've said.
I was going to say, that's what I was going to say.
So you're seeing a first here today, my friends. No, I don't see any need for brokers.
Thank you. Ju Hyung?
Well, but I think there. I already talked that this framework is bilateral, but actually this is what I heard from Korean negotiators. So they sometimes need some kind of messenger when North Korea does not want to talk to South Korea or the US directly. And then behind the stage, they just send very unofficial players to the North. And then they can, North Korean people will be more frank and will be more friendly with the kind of people, European people who they are familiar with. So that kind of messenger roles behind the stage is still available, I think. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. As for the second question, how long can North Korea sustain this isolation? Not only the sanctions, but also the trying to isolate the country from COVID. The media reports that the North Korean Central Bank doesn't even have the paper or the ink to print banknotes. How long can they sustain this isolation? So I will start this time with Jim.
When I was in the Foreign Office and they would say, well, what's China going to be like in 40 years? I would say, look, go back 40 years. What was China like? Then go back 40 years and what was China like? And so on and so on. I'd go back to 1900. And of course, nobody had ever got it right at any point whatsoever. And I think that's the problem with the future. Predicting it is a pretty useless game. The North Koreans have shown in the past amazing ability to take punishment. And it's not just the bad famine of the 1990s, there were famines in other years as well. and it's also taken the international hostility, and it's lived with all that. Now, I'm not saying that they wouldn't be willing to ease things a bit. I think there are hints that there's some easing underway. There's signs of activity at the Chinese border, not necessarily movement across it very much, at least not openly, but signs of rehabilitating or refurbishing customs posts and things like that, which are perhaps an indication that it might be a bit sooner rather than later. I think, as John said, that all the foreign embassies had to pull out. They couldn't get any money because the North Koreans are in a monetary stranglehold where the United States controls the international monetary system for all practical purposes. So nobody could get any money in unless, and the way embassies had begun to fund themselves and the aid agencies, staff went down to Beijing, drew vast sums of money out, shove it in your pockets, get on the airplane and go back up to Pyongyang. That's how things were living, hand to mouth. And until at least something like that can be restored, that there is not going to be a humanitarian presence or an embassy presence. But so I think, 18 months, 2 years, the North Koreans have gone longer than that suffering. And what matters is that the elite somehow get their supplies, and they do, through Beijing. Flights to Beijing still go on. And the people suffer. But then the people have always suffered. That's their role.
Ju Hyung?
Yeah. Well, North Korea has a very unique system, and well, it is true that in recent days, North Korea has been going through a hard time. Well, unusually, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un compared the current situation to the devastating 1990s famine, say Argus March, at a party conference in last April, and this was a rare admission of hardship for the North Korean authority. So. Yeah, it's true that North Korea is suffering from isolation, but a lot of Korean experts in North Korean domestic situations said that the situation is not as bad as people from outside, people from Western world would suppose. Well, they argue that North Korea has diversified food resources. So in the 1990s, the food source was limited, but after the 1990s Argus March, so North Korean government made a new plan for food security, and this is now somehow working. And moreover, when they really have difficulties in food security, they just could be assisted by China. And they will ask for help from China, but they are not doing so at this moment. So, situation is not that bad. In fact, South Korean National Intelligence Service also said recently that the food situation in North Korea is not so bad this year, thanks to this year's relatively good climate conditions for agriculture. So I think the focus should be the self-development policy. Kim Jong-un has emphasized 2 points, self-development and self-deterrence after the Hanoi summit. We have seen that the 8th Party Congress in January, those 2 points. So somehow Kim is also utilizing the COVID situation to strengthen his new policies and his control to people, domestically, I think.
Thank you. John?
When we talk about North Korean isolation, there are different degrees of this isolation. If we look at the kind of isolation that North Korea imposed on itself before the pandemic, the answer to your question is I think it could probably continue in that level of isolation for a considerable time, largely because although the regime still goes to extraordinary lengths to cut the population off from currents of thought, currents of information that might militate against the Juche orthodoxy, it does that alongside a surprisingly open economy. One of the paradoxes of North Korea is that if you look at declared trade, alongside the declared size of the overall economy, it is actually quite an open economy, and it could probably still keep going economically for some time. Not indefinitely. The rats have clearly got at the system. Was it the year before last? The party had to set up a special bureau to stop particularly young North Koreans going around humming South Korean pop songs. Why anybody should want to hum a South Korean pop song is beyond me, but apparently they did these things. Watching illicit South Korean films, the dramas that are so common on South Korean television, and dressing in South Korean clothes. The cultural infiltration had got on quite a way. And I suspect that they would have great trouble, and probably are having great trouble, enforcing orthodoxy to that extent. If, however, we are talking about the isolation that the regime has imposed on North Korea in an attempt to prevent a probably disastrous spread of COVID-19, that's a different matter entirely. I mean, North Korea has been locked down as a nation very firmly since February 2020, and the economic cost has been searing. Almost all trade has been stopped. Some shipments have got in, but really very few. Because the regime believes that COVID can be brought in on virtually anything. At one point, they were telling their citizens you could bring in COVID on packs of ice, which the scientists, I think, blinked at rather, but the regime clearly believed this. Fear of COVID, it runs very deep. How long it can continue this kind of isolation, I think, is a much more difficult question. I think the answer is probably not for very much longer. They have to do something about their economic situation, and the only way that they can do that is to ease the measures they've placed on themselves. We were saying just now that there's great debate about just how bad economically things have got in North Korea. The South Korean intelligence service has produced different reports saying different things at different times. I mean, one wonders just how far they know themselves what is going on. I think the best source for this is the ever-reliable General Secretary Kim Jong-un himself, who has described the situation as grim, described the economic challenges as unprecedented, and who's gone on television crying, weeping in front of the North Korean people for having let them down economically. And that kind of pressure, that sort of sense that the economy is plunging and there's hunger abroad, eats away at his political capital. I don't think we need to delude ourselves that the North Korean regime worries too much about people starving to death. What it does worry about is people getting angry because their relatives are dying of hunger and rising up against them. Sorry, I think I'm about to wander on to another subject here, but the evidence that the regime is now very worried indeed about lack of ideological discipline, lack of social cohesion, I think is growing, and I think the pressure really is on them to end the current period of isolation.
Thank you. And the final question is about the North Korean perspective on reunification. Would that be correct? Okay, I'll stick with John. So very quickly, the last question. North Korea's perspective on reunification.
Conversations on this with North Koreans. They are all in favor of reunification, far greater support for reunification than in the South. The trouble is that when they talk about reunification, what they mean is that they want to live the lives they see on those great South Korean documentaries, the dramas, where all South Koreans, as is well known, spend their lives in complex love triangles, driving around in fast cars and eating in the very best restaurants. And they want that. They think that's a really good thing to have. So if reunification means that, then yes, please. The regime is, of course, rather more cautious about this because most of the ideas for reunification put out by Seoul would effectively put the North Korean regime out of a job. When Germany reunified, in Pyongyang they circulated videos of former senior East German officials sitting destitute on park benches, having lost their offices, their homes, their salaries, everything. And senior officials were told, if we reunify, if the South takes us over, that's you. That's what's going to happen to you. They're probably right. I mean, you know, in a reunified Korea, under any kind of vision that Moon Jae-in might embrace, who is going to keep employing North Korean cadres? So North Korea will be happy for unification on its own terms, but somehow I don't see people in the South voting for that.
Thank you.
They always said,
Jim?
They always said to me, well, you know, the people in the South are longing to be put under Kim Jong-il's beneficent rule. That's how unification will come about. Them accepting us. Believe it if you like. That's it.
Yeah, I just briefly say, so actually North Korea has special order. I don't know this is the exact word in English, but anyways, yeah. Special order from Kim Il-sung, the founding father. So the purpose is the communist unification, but reunification. But I think North Korean officials will not say that this is not possible. So actually, at this moment, this is just the ideal purpose, and now their practical purpose is to secure the regime. So I think they would not really care about that. Mm-hmm.
Do we have time for one more? It's 5:15. Okay, let's. Should we take one or two more quickly? Any? I see a hand there and a hand there. So, okay.
Thank you for your talk. I'm a student. I'm a master's student from LSE, and my question is: it is argued by some international relations scholars that North Korea is not a revisionist state, and North Korea's development of nuclear weapons was driven by the perception of insecurity. So do you think North Korea is actually a status quo state? And how to consolidate the strategic mutual trust with North Korea to mitigate the security dilemma? Thank you.
Okay, so about confidence building, I suppose. And a second question,
Hi, I'm Nikki. I'm a master's student at King's, also a former journalist recently returned to school. So my question is about China. So recently we've seen there's a trend that like China kind of, warmed up, strengthened the relations with the North Korea, probably rhetorically. But like previous decades, like China seems to be, distancing itself from like North Korea to embrace the, international trade or, participate in international trade. So how do you see the role North Korea would play in the context of US and China rivalry at the moment? Thank you.
Okay. Right. Okay. So we got two more questions. The first one is North Korea, whether it's a revisionist or a status quo state, and what measures for alleviating tension, confidence building. And the second question is North Korea in the US-China rivalry. So should we start with Ju Hyung?
Can I just take second question?
Yes, you can.
Well, actually, I covered this issue when I was in Seoul a lot, but most of experts agreed that North Korea would tilt to China in the rivalry between the U.S. and China, and this situation would get more explicit. So that's exactly what a lot of experts and policymakers are worrying about at this moment. Yeah.
James, Jim, or John, would either of you like to have anything to add to this question? About China?
Firstly, can we please remember that China is China. China looks after Chinese interests, not Korean interests. At the moment, the arrangements on the Korean Peninsula suit China, and China continues to support North Korea. If China changed its mind and decided that, in fact, it wants different arrangements or that North Korea is simply more trouble than it's worth, China would throw North Korea under a bus like that. If you don't believe me, ask Gaddafi. Ask Bashir in Sudan, all China's other friends. China was not there to look after North Korea. China is there to look after China. Can can we, the other question was about the revisionist and...
Yeah, revisionist or status quo state and
confidence building measures.
Easing confidence building measures.
Yes, wow. Revisionist or status quo state, it would take me a long time to answer. If I can just pass to confidence building measures. The North Koreans have been offered confidence building measures like you wouldn't believe. I mean, the Americans, for a long period of negotiations, were going to the table with virtually everything they could think of. The trouble is that no confidence building measure that the United States or indeed the international community at large can offer reassures the North Koreans sufficiently that they feel able to surrender their nuclear weapons. At one point, they were saying that it's all very well that there's no nuclear weapons in the south of the peninsula, if that is indeed the case. But of course, the United States can reach North Korea with nuclear weapons launched from the United States. Therefore, not until the United States abandons its own nuclear arsenal will North Korea denuclearize, at which point the Americans virtually give up on the negotiations. So yes, I mean, the approach is entirely sound, and it's been tried with considerable energy over long periods of time. It doesn't get anywhere because the North Korean lack of a sense of security is so deep that you can't actually get to the bottom of it.
Jim, North Korea between China and the US and confidence building measures? Either of those.
I surrender. I agree with John about China and the role of China. And the North Koreans think that as well. Many of them speak very good Chinese amongst the officials. They won't normally use it, except with the Chinese. They will never, even though they've got Chinese-speaking people with from Britain or anywhere else in Europe, they won't use it because it's the Chinese. I mean, Koreans, north and south now, but once a united peninsula, spent 2,000 years making damn sure that they were not Chinese. They speak Korean. They took things from China, obviously, architecture and so on, but it was always modified, just as it was in Japan. The layout of Korean cities traditionally is similar to Chinese ones, but with slight modifications because it's Korea. So I think there's no love lost particularly between the Chinese and the Koreans historically, and I don't think there's much in the present. I think, just to develop a point John made, that if, as the Chinese once hoped, that Korea would see less American presence and it could then tolerate a united Korea, that might have been acceptable. But that is not the case. And so the Chinese, I think, are quite content for a divided Korea. As for confidence building measures, I agree with John that there is really nothing that will provide the sort of guarantee that North Korea wants. There's nothing that will guarantee I want the sort of things I want, that I should live forever and my health should keep good and all those sort of things. That's the sort of level you're working at. If you give them, you offer them this, that, then they'll always find something else that really is very important to add to the mix. So it doesn't work unless I suppose if the United States was to withdraw from the Pacific, withdraw from the world, as once or twice under Trump, people thought this might be the beginning of a process, but I don't think it is going to happen. Then the North Koreans might have been reassured, but otherwise, no.
And the last word to John.
North Korean China antipathy. Yes, Jim is entirely right. There's not a lot of love lost between them. Just finishing on an anecdote, a few years ago, I was hosting a dinner in Beijing where I used to work, and a senior Chinese official from the foreign ministry came in an absolutely foul mood and sat there glowering. So I said, "What's wrong?" He said, I've just had to deal with a delegation of Iranians," he said. "They were slimy, they were dishonest, they were craven, they were just horrible to deal with. They They were like North Koreans, he said.
Thank you very much. On which note, I would like to thank the speakers, and please show your appreciation for the speakers. Thank you very much. And there is now a reception, right, on the ground floor. Yeah, in the arcade on the ground floor.